Welcome to the Ideas on Stage podcast, your regular insight into leadership communication.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Ideas on Stage podcast, your place to get best insights in all things to do with presentations creation, slide design, Q&A, speaker coaching, and business communication in general. So my name is Rickwood, and every podcast we actually have an expert who will come and share their insights with us for each episode. And today I have the absolute pleasure of welcoming a very special guest, the legendary Jerry Weissman. So welcome, Jerry. Jerry is a presentations consultant with a career spanning 40 years. He's actually originally
30
years. Okay, thanks for correcting me that. Originally from a graduate of Stanford University, he worked in television and then was persuaded by a friend to enter into the domain of presentations consulting. He's worked with many US companies and beyond, particularly in the tech sector, some great, very influential names from as far as Netflix to Microsoft, Cisco Systems, Google, and many others. And he's actually helped these people to increase their market share and others to get investments. Jerry actually founded his own company in the early 90s, if I'm correct, which he rebranded in 2017 called Suasive. And of course, he's an author of 5 fabulous books, 3 of which we will be discussing today. Those books are Presenting to Win, Power Presenter, and In the Line of Fire, a book about how to answer tough questions. So Jerry has influenced many captains of our industry within the presentation sector, notably Gar Reynolds, the author of Presentations Then, who once said that Jerry is the Jedi Master of presentations. So that's pretty cool right there. But also others such as Guy Kawasaki and Nati Duarte and many others. And I would just say finally that Jerry certainly, for my career, has done me lots of service with his tools over the years since I've been reading Jerry's work, which goes back even before I joined Ideas on Stage, and in particular the mental methods. So I'm looking forward to finding out and to listening more from Jerry himself. So thanks, Jerry, for joining us from your home in Silicon Valley.
My pleasure.
And that's actually so that introduction was worked on using one of your techniques, which of course is verbalization. So there you go. I learned that from you. Now, today's podcast is really, just to frame it before we start, it's really, as we were discussing before, the unification of the presenter's skills. And really, because you have such an entire methodology, I've got a series of questions here, really, which will go through the methodology in a loose structure, starting with story, a little bit on slides, then speaking, and then Q&A. So that's really how we'll do that. So good. Let me just ask you with this question. Just to, coming back to the problem, that persistent problem, which is, in the 30 years of developing these tools for business presenters, for you, how do the problems still persist today in 2021? What are people still struggling with?
Well, I have to go back to the founding of my company back in 1990, when I had the privilege of having lunch with one of the premier venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, Don Valentine, the man who invested in Apple, Google, Cisco Systems, and the like. And we had lunch. We spoke about one of the companies he was going to be taking public. And during that lunch, he said something to me that is true that day as it is today. And it is, Jerry, the problem is that no one knows how to tell a story. But the bigger problem is no one knows that they don't know how to tell a story. So all the lessons we've learned back to Socrates and Aristotle have gone out the window. And the reason is we are all living on the slide decks, and people tend to shuffle slide decks. In business, the lingua franca of business is the slideshow. Send me your deck. Well, decks allow presenters to shuffle the cards like a Las Vegas card dealer. And when the shuffle of the slides go, because one person would say, I think this should go first, and that should go second, and this should go up there. Once that shuffle occurs, the story is lost. And once the story is lost, the audience is lost. Pervasive, universal problem.
Yes, very, very true. Yes, the whole send me your slides. So yeah, sending me your slides in advance, that's still very much happening. And the fact that there is no, there's no, I mean, storytelling is sequencing, right? Sequencing ideas into a certain flow, a certain structure. And without that,
as they say in Hollywood, it's called the story arc.
Right.
Or I know that you're in Paris. Yep. And French people have what's called rouge fil. Pardon my poor French pronunciation, but it means the red thread.
Right.
And
yes.
The red thread refers to continuity. And it can refer to anything in business, a business plan, but it also applies to rhetoric. And if there is no red thread, if the audience cannot follow, you lose the audience.
That's correct. Yes, indeed. Yes, the fil rouge. Yes, I people use this a lot when they talk about anything, just getting to the end of the idea. So sure, that's very true. The red line. Yeah, great. All right. So let's have another question. So let's talk about your methodology. As an overview, what are the components of your methodology, and how do they slot together to help the presenter?
The important factor is that the components you described, and which are the three components covered in my major books, but there are actually four components: the narrative, the slides that illustrate the narrative, the delivery skills, and the Q&A skills. They have to work together. You cannot unbundle these skills. They all have to have a unified integrity as a presenter moves forward in the development of the story. Because of my background in television, it's right there on our website. I worked at CBS. The methodology I developed was right out of the broadcast center on 57th Street in Manhattan. One of my jobs was to provide tough questions for the great Mike Wallace. So with that as an imprimatur on my site, people say, oh, can we call you and have you help us and give us some tips and tricks about how to handle tough questions? That's what our PR people do. Well, I'm sorry, I can't help you with your questions if I don't understand your story. If your story is not baked, if your story is not integral, if your story is not solidly clear as to the message you want to communicate and why it's important to the audience, I can't help you with the questions. So all the skills, going back to the story, fuel the way people answer questions. Also, I'm sure you're aware of being in the trade, Michael, that the number one fear people have in the world is public speaking, and people hate to stand up in front of a room. And the famous story is told by Jerry Seinfeld, the American comic, who said people fear, in a poll, people fear speaking before a group more than death. And Seinfeld's punchline is, so that means people would rather be in the grave than giving this eulogy.
Right.
But
yeah, that's true.
Because when people call and say, can you help me as a coach to control my nerves, to stop my hands from trembling, for my mouth to stop pasting?
Yeah.
The first step is to get your mind clear on what you say. If the presenter's mind is not clear, all the tips and tricks about voice and body language and gestures are just flapping arms and flapping gums. The presenter has to have a clear idea of what they're going to say. Lighten the load before you step up to the front of the room. And that's what we do at Swayson. We start with a story. I cannot start in the middle. I cannot start by telling people what to do with their hands and arms or give them tips and tricks for their Q&A session without having a solid, well-told, rouge fil story.
Mm. Yes, and that's very true. I'm rereading Presenting to Win right now, and you say in the book that So you would spend a lot of time with your clients working on that story in that initial phase. And it's true, certainly in our experience, you know, when I'm working with clients, you know, it's really sitting down, first of all, asking what is it the audience need from them, and then getting those ideas germinated and structuring it. And this can take a long time, but it's really got to be done before we move on to anything else, and even several sessions.
I know that you're fluent in French, so pardon my expression, but the French do have a wonderful expression, vaut la peine. It's worth the effort.
Yes.
It's worth the effort to put the time in the development of the story and the clarification of the ideas in the presenter's mind so that the presenter can then think about body language, voice, answering questions, and even designing slides.
Yes, it is vaut la peine indeed. Absolutely. Great. Well, good. Let's continue with story. I've got another question for you on that. So let's talk a little bit about some of the tools that you write about with story development. So, and particularly with audience need, in presenting to win, both in power presenting to win and power presenter, you extensively talk about Whiffy, and it's nothing to do with Wi-Fi, right? Whiffy. So, just want to explain to us what Whiffy is, please.
Yes, Whiffy is an acronym that's spelled W-I-I-F-Y, and it's based on the more familiar one, W-I-I-F-M, which is what's in it for me. And when the presenter is thinking what's in it for you, the why of Whiffy, the presenter then focuses on the audience and then designs the story to the audience. This simple concept gives lie to the classic business concept of the corporate deck. There can be no corporate deck because a company cannot give the same presentation to one customer as to another, because two different customers have two different needs. Now, does this mean that a presenter has to reinvent the wheel and throw everything out and restart from the beginning? No, but from the very start, from the very moment the process begins, the presenter needs to understand who the audience is and what they need in order to deliver the presentation or to be persuaded by the presenter.
Absolutely, yeah. Yes, it's sometimes I have used that very same expression in some cases, and actually just to say what's in it for you or what's in it for them can put a perspective sometimes. Even if people are thinking about the audience's needs, sometimes just by wording it like that can sort of make people think slightly different and say, actually, yes, what is it in it? What is in it for them?
Right.
You know, that's why often many pitches and start with the problem. You know, what's the inconvenience? What's the pain points? You know, we talk about that when I'm coaching startups. I mean, I'm doing a lot of work at the moment with HEC on this sort of with people with technological ideas. But the thing is that what is the pain point? What's in it for the customer, basically, or what's in it?
Let me give you a very simple, practical application. Here in Silicon Valley, we have two types of technology. We have electronic technology, but we also have life sciences technology. And I work with a lot of companies that are developing drugs and diagnostics and devices and the like. And I flunked organic chemistry at college, but I help them to communicate with their audience. And frequently, because the life scientists are scientists, they want all the data. And they have all these tests and these graphs and these charts. And my instruction to them as a coach is, you can show this chart to your investor audience, but you have to tell them why this chart is important to them as an investor.
Right.
Which transforms the narrative of that chart.
Yes, it's like that Netflix example that you used in Presenting to Win, where the original slide was very much geared towards the end customer. Actually, you changed it to interest the investor, by basically shifting the interest of the market. Yeah.
You're talking about the Netflix IPO roadshow, and I had the privilege of working with Reed Hastings. It was actually the second time I worked with Reed. He'd taken another company public in the late 90s called Pure Atria Software. And when he came to Netflix, he was he called again and said, let's polish the presentation. And he remembered much of what I told him, except that the one slide that described Netflix's original business was targeted to subscribers.
Great.
So we simply converted it to target to investors.
Yeah, slight adjustment, but yeah, changes everything. Okay, good. Let's have another question. So in presenting to Win, you cover a lot on brainstorming. You talk about clustering and the parallels with the Roman room method. So yeah, we won't go into too much detail perhaps on this one, but can you just expand on that a bit?
You're asking, you threw a lot of tools into that pie. You're actually describing three very important steps. The first is to set the context of the presentation, is to understand who the audience is, which goes back to the Whiffy, and also what the point of the presentation, what is the goal of the presentation, because all too many presentations do not have an apparent goal. Think about the time you've sat in the audience and you've said to yourself, what's the point of this? Or as the teenagers put it, and your point is? I know you have a teenage son. Isn't that true, Michael? Did you say?
Actually, I do. I know. Actually, I have one who's 10 and one who's 20. So they're either side of the teens.
Well, I'm sure they've said that to you. Dad, and your point is?
Yes, of course.
Well, imagine that from an audience to a presenter. What's your point? And your point is? So we first set the context. Then the next thing we do is brainstorming. And the reason it's important to do brainstorming is because human minds think in random fashion. And when we approach a subject, we approach it with multiple ideas, and each idea has a bias, a precondition, a preconception, tangential thoughts, orthogonal thoughts, and all of these thoughts come bubbling up in the brain. A great influence in my career is Daniel Kahneman's brilliant book, and you ought to get him for your podcast, called Thinking Fast and Slow, in which he describes this process of the brain. So the key is to let all of that happen in the preparation and not the presentation. Get the brainstorm out onto an external surface. Once it's all out and you have all those random thoughts, then you can pick and choose what you want to tell the audience, and pick and choose them and distill them into small groups of ideas with a maximum of 6, ideally 3 or 4 ideas. You call them Roman columns. The reason I call them Roman columns in the book goes back to the days of the Roman Empire, when the great orators used to speak for hours on end without any notes. They used the columns of the forum as memory prompts. By the way, that's an entirely separate business. There's an entire cottage industry called the Roman room method, in which people learn to memorize decks of cards. I'm not asking presenters to memorize decks of cards. I'm asking them to distill their ideas. And once a presenter has a distillation of 4, 5, or 6 major themes, then we apply le rouge fil.
Right. Yes,
that's
exactly.
The process in a nutshell.
Yes, actually, and just about the Roman columns, I mean, for me, that's a nice image, because a Roman column for me represents a cluster of ideas, right? And what's the big, this is coming back to the problem about the fact that people are thinking in presentations in the terms of slides, but they really should be in the terms of Roman columns. If for example, you have 3 or 4 columns that you need to get through, or 5 throughout the presentation, there may be 100 slides illustrating all of that. You see what I mean? So it's and this is the challenge, really. You know, I used to build huge presentations for a French tech company called Quant. They're a privacy-based search engine. They're actually used now by the French government, and so I worked with the founder for 4 years on this. And I would produce slide decks, which sometimes were 120 slides long, but we never had any more than 3 Roman columns. It was really just, you know, you need so much animation and so much, because it was very conceptual and visual in order to communicate it. But ultimately, the Roman columns were actually very few, and that should be the way. The problem with a lot of bad presentations, corporate presentations that they might have 24 Roman columns in there. That's the problem.
Right. And of course, if a presenter walks up to the front of the room with 24 Roman columns in mind, the nervousness level will escalate to panic.
Well, this is where you got another French word, which is gabage, which means to stuffing the audience, and that's what's basically what's happening. Gabage is like stuffing geese to make foie gras, which is that's the time of year now. It's Christmas,
Perfect.
so all right.
Gavage leads to gout.
Right? Yes, it certainly does. All right, let's shift it questions a little bit towards the slides. And there's a quote here I want to give back to you that I've been using for years, and I have a slide with your picture on it with this quote, which I've been showing to people for years, which is if you make it hard on the audience, they're going to make it harder on you. Are you specifically talking about bad slides in this quote?
Talking about everything.
Okay.
If the story is too difficult to comprehend, imagine if this Zoom call were to be a podcast and you didn't see my eyes or your handsome beard or your handsome scarf, and you were to, very French.
It's a fil rouge, exactly, yeah.
Right. Imagine if all we had to react to was the story, and it was difficult to follow the story. Well, wait a minute. What does that have to do with? How did he get there from here? What does that have to do with what he just said? That makes it hard for the audience because they stop listening and try to recalibrate what the presenter has said, and they stop listening. Game over.
Right. So the eyes glaze over. Do you have that is it Migo thing that you talk about presenting to win?
You have to credit that to the old Time magazine. I learned that from the editors of Time magazine. They coined that phrase, MEGO, my eyes glaze over.
Right.
Or as one of my clients put it, me go away.
Okay. Yeah, I can tell you there's a lot of that happening still. I won't say who gave the presentation, but I saw a presentation happen at the World Bank about a couple of years ago, and crikey, there was a lot of glazed eyes happening during that particular presentation. So, all right, next question. I read in an interview once that you said it's the presenter at fault with poor slides and not the software. Is it a case of a bad workman blames his tools?
Yes, this is where I draw a line between myself and that famous graphic artist. What is his name? Like, I'm drawing a blank on it now. The man who puts out the map of Napoleon's attack on Russia and retreat from Russia.
Hans Rosling. The
Right.
TED Talk?
Yes.
Hans Rosling, yes.
Right. In which he says PowerPoint causes the problem. PowerPoint is not the problem.
Right.
It's the person who designs the PowerPoint. It's the pen. It's not the pen. It's the penmanship. If the presenter uses the PowerPoint for multi-purposes, what we at Swaysive call it is a twofer. Here's my slide deck that I will display to you, and here's the hard copy. So now the hard copy is meant to be a standalone. Oh, well, Michael, you can't make it? Before you come, would you please send me the hard copy? Now, there's no Michael to tell me what this means, so this hard copy has to be very detailed. But if I put that up on the screen, all that detail, the audience is busy making it hard for the audience, trying to understand what the slide says, because there are so many words on there, or so many bar charts, or so many life sciences clinical trials. Game over. So that's not the fault of PowerPoint. PowerPoint will allow you to put one word on a slide. PowerPoint will allow you to put one image on a slide, an icon, and you, the presenter, do it as a headline.
But just to bounce off, of that, it's the next question, but I think we can mix it in here. Slides when you started in this game in the late 80s, early 90s, I mean, slides still have come a long way. Because when I think about the first, when we first saw PowerPoint, I mean, I was still a child, in 1986 or whenever it came out. I was 12 years old. But I mean, you still had basically click to add title, click to add subtitle, click to add sub. You know what I mean? That's the first thing you saw when you opened it. So people just did what they were told, right? I mean, that's the early days. That's what it was. But of course, now it's moved along. It's moved much further along. But I mean, particularly now, I think that is very, very true that people are still not using it right, because all the tools now are much more widely available compared to when it was when it started back in the 80s, right?
Well, back in the 80s, many of the people I work with here in Silicon Valley were using acetates.
Right.
Transparencies with the overhead projector, the classic OHP, the dinosaur of presentations.
Yeah.
And then many Harvard Graphics came up with some software, but also I work with a very unique product called Video Show, a dedicated product that was created to create presentations that not only had the slides, but it also had the display mechanism, a big elephantine box that one attached to a TV set. And even though the software for there was, as you say, title, subtitle, sub-bullets and all that, I could override it. I could skip the subtitle. I could, instead of putting 8 bullets, I could put 4. I mean, it's the choice of the presenter. But if the presenter is focused on what the audience needs and making it easy for the audience, the presenter simply takes the essence of the slide and puts it on the title. Or it just considers it a headline. I'm looking at today's Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
Stocks decline on fresh pandemic worries. Mm-hmm. I'll bet you, not even as a newsman, can sit there and talk for 3 minutes on that, on what you know.
For sure.
Very simple. That's all you need. Stocks decline on fresh pandemic worries. 6 words.
Yeah.
You don't need sentences beyond that. Sure, we could read the entire story, but we don't need the entire story. The story comes from the presenter.
That's great. Yes. So yeah, finding the titles from headlines. Yeah, that's a nice idea. And it's true that you have a simple headline. You throw it up there on a slide, and then everyone has an opinion on it, and you can actually present that and speak for 3 minutes. Great. All right. Let's move it on to delivery, and then we'll finish on Q&A. So one thing that struck me from reading Power Presenter, this is one of my favorite books, is the emphasis on building from the inside out. Can you tell us more about the mental method?
Well, here again, I have another inspiration. I had an inspiration too, to create the mental method of presenting. And it's a book called The Inner Game of Tennis.
Right.
A best-selling book by a man named Timothy Galway, in which Galway said, don't think about your arm and your ankle and your wrist and your shoulders. Think about the ball. Get outside of your body and think about the ball. Where is the ball and where do you want to send it? That makes the entire body work to the ball, not to the racket, not to how many fingers do you use in the grip? It's been years since I played tennis, but watch the ball. So the equivalent in presentations is, what's the audience doing? How are they receiving you? And in the Power Presenter, we call that a 2-step process. Read the reaction. Read the reaction. I'm looking at you, Michael, to be sure that you're nodding and getting me. And there you are, nodding and smiling at me. You've gotten it. And you now break into a big, toothy smile, telling me that I have made my point to you.
Yes, indeed.
But if I didn't get that handsome smile, what I would do is adjust my content. I would take it a step deeper. And of course, that takes you out of your body and out of, will I succeed?
Yes, no, it's great. It's getting those real time reactions out of people. One of the things you mentioned in that book is you say that is one thing is to make sure that you get that eye connect, and you get that in registering of the connection with the eyes, but also simply that you want to get head nods. It's one thing actually just achieving your objective by delivering the presentation without something falling off the wall or whatever, but really the other objective is getting people to nod their heads.
Right. Most presentations are done by throwing information at the audience and not seeing where it lands.
Right.
Go back to the tennis analogy. You watch the ball and see where it travels. So in the Power Presenter, the mental method breaks down to 2 simple steps. Read the reaction and then adjust the content. I see that Michael Rickwood understands what I'm saying, so I move on. I end my story. If Michael Rickwood does that, then I give him a little bit more.
Yeah, right. Exactly. But one of the big problems, I've worked on a lot of TEDx events and also similar style conferences. I mean, since TED turned up, I mean, everyone was doing TED-style events. They put the round circle carpet on the floor and put the speaker in the middle and put them under lights and put the audience in the dark, you see. So every time I was working on one of these things, I said, no, we've got to get some light on the audience. They need to be able to see who they're talking to. So that's something I was very, very adamant about. Don't put the audience in the dark. It's not the theater.
There's a balance there, Michael. There is a balance there. And for technical reasons, the production people do want the audience dark and the presenter with full lights. You can ask for a bit of spill light into the front rows and do that. But the production team doesn't like it when you tell them to put the lights in the house.
No, I'm exaggerating. But I was always just for a little bit of light so the audience can, because they can see them, the front wall, and usually that was okay. But sometimes, it's I've spoken at events where I literally could not see anyone, and
if I may, Michael, and you'll appreciate this having come from acting yourself.
Yeah,
a TED Talk is less a presentation than a performance. Less a presentation than a performance because there's the cameras, there's the audience, there's the production elements. How many people in business give TED Talks every day? How many people in business give multiple presentations to potential customers, investors, and partners a day? My books are for them, not for TEDx or TED.
Yes, I tell you something. I worked on so many corporate company events, though, which have tried to emulate the TED thing, because they'll put the events on in the evening, and that's the thing. But I mean, you're right. I mean, you say. I think in presenting to win, there might be millions of presentations happening any time around the world, and very few of them have succeeded. And it's true, there are millions of them happening in offices and in daylight, with small audiences, for sure. For sure, and I think I read in Power Presenter that one of the things is getting people to move away from this sense of feeling like they should perform, and remembering that they are communicators and that this is business. That you didn't turn up and tell them how to move, or my experience of working, for example, in the luxury industry is that they're very focused on performance. They're very focused on perfection, but of course, turning up and say, look, this is about connecting with people. This is about getting their reactions, making sure that they're following, that this is effective, that the message is getting across. This is not a show.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's only slightly different in TED Talks because there are people in the spill light at the front that you can see, and you use them as sort of as an ombudsman for the rest of the audience.
Absolutely. All right, let's have another one. Can you tell us about body language and the comfort zone paradox?
The comfort zone paradox.
That's another Roman column in itself, isn't it?
The comfort zone paradox it goes this way. What feels comfortable to the presenter when they're up in front of the room is to do this. or this, or this. Why? Because it's very much like an animal when the animal feels danger. When animals, four-legged animals, feel danger, they want to huddle in and protect the underbelly. That's the effect of adrenaline. Adrenaline is in four-legged animals and in two-legged animals. So the two-legged animal feels comfortable doing this, but it looks defensive or protective. What doesn't look defensive or protective is this. But when someone opens up like this, the body feels exposed and vulnerable. So the comfort zone paradox is this. Feels comfortable, looks uncomfortable. Looks comfortable, feels uncomfortable.
This is great. I think, I mean, you know, I'm going to just throw in that other question about gestures being too staged, particularly when it comes to corporate presentations. My experience working with leaders is that they're inevitably actually being coached at some point, and you get this sort of rather sort of strange neutral gestures happening. You know, I can't really see any, but you know, this where everything's sort of always here when they're not gesturing, and it always looks for me very stilted. And what I always liked about this idea, and when you talk about the mental method, obviously not with just the eyes, but also with the hands and with the reach out and dropping the arms when you have a big pause, and sort of it evacuates that tension. I know that it's comfortable to be here, but you know, with these sort of body wraps.
Michael, you're throwing about four different.
Yeah, I know. It's terrible. But
and I'm delighted you read it. You read the book so thoroughly. You passed the test perfectly. You're a brilliant student. But let me just unpack that, if I may.
Sure.
Before I started my own company, I actually spent a couple of years as a hired hand for another company that taught presentation skills. And part of their curriculum was to coach gestures. Every human being has a different way to gesture. And every human being has a different pattern. And that pattern is governed by the adrenaline instructions to the limbs. So I spent my days at that third-party company, that other company as a hired hand, forcing people to do the gestures in my curriculum. At the end of the day, I won because I was more persuasive and I had the manual, but I felt exhausted and I felt also that I had cheated them. So from the day I opened the door to my own offices, I said, no gesture coaching. Zero. Let it happen naturally. Be aware that this looks uncomfortable, this looks comfortable, and that you have to get over the paradox and open up. That's all I tell people. That's all I tell people.
That's awesome. That's all. But that's it, though. You know, yeah, because people want that. That's the thing. And it's like, you know what?
What do I do with my hands?
But
what do I do with my hands? They really work all day, but when I present, I prefer to leave them back at my desk.
Yes, it's called thousands of years of evolution, right? We just use our hands, and that's it. So don't think about it. Right, great.
Be natural is the bottom line. Be natural.
Yes.
What comes naturally.
All right, great. So let's just finish on Q&A. I've got a couple of more questions here before we wrap up. So, In the Line of Fire has to be, in my opinion, the best book ever written on how to handle tough questions. So what inspires you? Politics, leadership? What inspired you to write that book?
Mike Wallace.
Wallace?
Mike Wallace at CBS.
Mike Wallace. Yes, of course, yes.
Mike inspired me by giving me tongue lashings as a young associate producer if the questions weren't difficult enough. You'll appreciate this living in Paris. One of my early assignments was in Paris. I worked with a French team from Cisco Systems, And during the day, one woman kept challenging me, my whole methodology. But I answered her politely and kept going, and she asked questions and challenged and challenged and challenged me. At the end of the day, she came up to me and she said, I hope you don't think I was being rude, but that's what we French do. We are Cartesian. We ask questions. Actually, she's now in the new edition of Presenting to Win, the one that just came out. This young woman named Hélène. But I tell you that because it's not just French people, but investors and customers want answers to questions. Mike Wallace wants answers to questions because he wanted them to be, to create a stir because conflict is drama. Good, tough questions make good TV. Why do business people ask tough questions? They ask tough questions because of that same young woman I met in Paris 30 years ago. Because they need answers. They want validation of your premise. And if you cannot validate your premise, they don't want to do business with you. They don't want to invest in you. They don't want to buy your product. They don't want to be your partner. They don't want to approve your proposal. So what inspired me was the understanding that Mike Wallace asked tough questions because that was good TV. But business people ask tough questions because, by the way, when I met that young woman I described to you, I hadn't written the book yet. The book came 12 years later.
Wow.
But in those 12 years, I saw investors asking tough questions because they'd say, well, wait a minute. You're going up against the big leader in the field. What makes you think that you can compete against that 8,000-pound gorilla? And if that CEO or CMO or CFO cannot answer that question, if the competitive strategy is not laid down very clearly, because we did that in the first session on the story, then the question is going to get splattered the presenter is going to be splattered all over the wall because they will appear unprepared, unprofessional, no investment, no deal.
Well, actually, I mean, one of the things that's been happening is that presentations are getting shorter because of YouTube, because of pitching and the TED and everything. Presentations are getting shorter, but that doesn't mean that we're having less time for them. It just means that the presentations get shorter, the Q&A is getting longer, and I think that there is a market, for this approach, for your process, more and more today than ever, and actually, you talk a lot about accountability with business leaders, and for those of us following politics around the world, we can watch Q&A with certain politicians, which can be very satisfactory, and others are not as satisfactory at all. Simply, they just do not answer the question. But when it comes
to that point, Michael, the first edition of In the Line of Fire, the book about Q&A, was in 2000, I would say 2008. And the current book that just came out last week is the third edition. Nothing has changed in the methodology between edition 1, edition 2, and edition 3, except the case studies. Edition 1 and edition 2 were based on U.S. presidential election and the debates and the contests that went on. I took all of them out because most politicians today just fail to answer questions. That cannot be in business. The new version of In the Line of Fire is almost exclusively, except for the classic Kennedy-Nixon debate, which is just iconic at this point, is filled with examples of business. And guess what most of them are? Most of them are based on the quarterly earnings calls, which are available to anybody to listen to. Every company in the public market has to have a earnings call during which they take questions from analysts. Listen to those questions from analysts. And if those questions are not answered satisfactorily by the CEO, the stock tanks. So the book is filled with examples of people who did it well in their earnings calls and people who did it poorly. And the ones who did it well serve as positive role models of the methodology we teach at Swaysive and is pervades the entire In the Line of Fire.
Yes, and well, and particularly also when you have a crisis happening,
Absolutely.
For example, I remember one CEO getting into real trouble after the Gulf of Mexico disaster in 2010. The former CEO of BP, had big problems.
Tony Hayward.
Yeah, Tony Hayward answering questions, and he had to step down. He's in the book. Okay.
It's the lead off case study of how not to do it.
Okay, because I use the example as well a lot in my trainings.
But it's well worth. This will kind of tie back to one thing we talked about earlier, when Tony Hayward was asked about the big oil spill that BP had occurred in the Gulf of Mexico. He said it was awful. People, he feels terrible for the people. He said, and I want my life back.
Yeah,
that was his quote.
I know that's what he's remembered for.
There's no Whiffy in that.
No, there isn't. It's dreadful.
And your 7-figure salary or 8-figure salary, will be okay. Will get you through the difficult times.
Well, I'm actually personally connected to that particular story because my great uncle was his boss once. So my great uncle was head of exploration. His boss, yes. My great uncle, Frank Rickwood, was head of exploration at BP back in the 70s. And Tony Hayward worked underneath him. And so, but my uncle passed away, I think 1 year before that happened. I dread to think what he would have thought of all of that.
You'll be interested to know that, speaking of bosses, you'll be interested to know that after Tony Hayward's big faux pas, you have me speaking French now. After Tony Hayward's big faux pas, there was an enormous uproar about it. And one quote that's in the book too, in the Line of Fire, came from Obama, who said, unlike your uncle, he said, I wouldn't hire that man.
Right. Yes. Well, that's great. That's great. All right. Awesome. Well, look, I'm keeping my eye on the time because I don't want to keep you for any longer than scheduled. So I've got just 2 more questions for you. So we both studied acting in our pasts, and I love the term actor's actor. For example, Al Pacino is an actor's actor. So it's a frame of reference and inspiration for all actors everywhere. So with this in mind, I consider you, with your long experience in deep methodology, as the coach's coach, with that same idea in mind. Now, our industry today is ever expanding amid digital disruption, the evolving needs to communicate efficiently, ethically, and memorably, and also within the online format as we're currently doing. And any words of wisdom for the young coach looking to enter the industry? What do they need to learn?
I'll leave the industry to the side. I'll just, if you want, the best I can give you is instructions to a young coach to be a more effective coach rather than penetrating the industry.
Yes, of course.
And the instructions are these. Beware of your curriculum. Your curriculum may not work because too rigid a curriculum may force a coach into being too forceful, and not intuitive enough to evoke or coach someone to be effective. Because, the word coach is from transportation. You need to move people from one place to another. So that's what a coach needs to do, move people. But all too often, and I've seen videos of coaches, because we're expanding. And a couple of young coaches have sent us their videos, and I heard this phrase frequently. I want you to. I like what you did there. We don't care about the coach's wants and likes. You hear the difference?
Yes.
What's wrong with that?
Yeah.
I want you to, as
Yeah.
opposed to, try this.
Yes.
Takes
Yeah,
the word, just as reporters are told not to use the I in representing journalism.
Yes. So it's really
Leave the word I out of their coaching because we don't care about the coach, what the coach likes.
So it's humility you're talking about, humility and serving the audience, basically serving the context, the audience.
Whiffy.
Whiffy. Great. All right. Well, look, let's just finish on one more question. Sorry, you wanted to finish that?
Can I just give you one more?
Yes, of course.
The context being in Paris, one of my favorite dining experiences in the world.
Yes.
When waiters come up and say, I really like on the menu.
Yes. Well, I can tell you once having a terrible experience here eating in France. It wasn't in Paris, but one of my friends who was an actress, she asked for a steak to be well done. And the chef, the waiter said, well, I can't tell the chef to cook your steak like that. And she said, sorry. He said, no, I'm not. No, it's either rare or it's nothing. He refused to tell the chef to overcook her steak. So there you go. Not much Whiffy there. No. Okay, so let's just finish on one more question for you. So do you have any final words for our audience, Jerry?
Yes, it's a line from the great film Casablanca. It's still the same old story. Tell the story. If you don't get the story, don't bother with all the rest of it. All the glitzy PowerPoint, all the flapping of arms and gums, and all the canned answers to all the questions will be meaningless if the presenter doesn't have a clear rouge fil.
Jerry Weissman, thank you very much for your time. And thanks everyone who's tuned in to watch the video. Please stick around for the next one. Jerry, thanks again.
Thanks, Michael.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Ideas on Stage podcast, there are many more you might like, so please subscribe, leave us a review, and tell us what you think. You can find many more ideas on business communication at ideasonstage.com or by searching for Ideas on Stage on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and goodbye for now.